in honour of one of the great scholars of this university, and particularly of media and communication studies within this university and further afield, Jay Blumler, who is with us this evening. It's a great opportunity for us each year to think about how politics is being discussed, how citizens are able to make their voices heard or not heard, what kind of challenges we're facing as a democracy, if we're a democracy. Tonight, the speaker is somebody who I'm very pleased to be able to introduce, because I've long considered that she is one of the most innovative thinkers in our field. Professor Lisbeth van Zoomen, who comes from Erasmus University in the Netherlands, where she is Professor of Media and Popular Culture, where she is also the Dean of the Graduate School of that university. Many of you will know her work. Several of you will have read what I think is a classic of the field of political communication, Entertaining the Citizen. But many of you, I think, might be here because you are particularly interested in what she is going to talk about this evening, which, if I can just take 20 seconds to say as part of this introduction, strikes me as one of the great moral crises of our age, and perhaps something that everybody in this room should be listening with a view to thinking about where they stand. And that is to say, the migration and displacement of millions of people across the world, many of whom feel insecure and unwelcome everywhere. To get across the world for you and I might not be very difficult. To get across the world for vast numbers of people requires a passport. And that is the subject of Lisbeth's talk this evening. She'll be talking about identity, identification, and the passport, after which we'll be open to questions, discussion, and then more informally, an opportunity to have some drinks and food together and perhaps talk to Lisbeth in a more informal environment. But for now, it's my great pleasure to introduce to the University of Leeds and School of Media and Communication, Lisbeth van Zoomen.
Especially to deliver the Jay Blumler Lecture. And if I look around, I see a couple of people of my own generation, and for those, you can imagine how incredible the honor is for our generation to deliver the Jay Blumler Lecture, because Jay has been an inspiration for me, but also for my whole generation of scholars. So I'm really happy, and I was also a bit nervous about coming here today, but I saw so many friends that those nerves have gone. Thank you also for calling me an innovative thinker, and I might have been so innovative today that I came up with a slightly different angle to my talk. I'm going to talk about the passport, but I'm going to talk about something else as well. I'm going to talk about the internet as well, about identity and identification. And I want to do so from a perspective of Jay's work, and specifically from the perspective of vulnerable values. And Jay has written about vulnerable values in public broadcasting in the 1980s and the 1990s, and his work was really, really important at the time. It was a time of deregulation and intense competition in public broadcasting with commercial broadcasting. And Jay questioned, among a range of things, how these processes affected the pluralism and the diversity in public broadcasting. And what I want to explore today is whether that notion of a vulnerable value of identity, diversity, pluralism can be used to examine identity and identification. I will do so by discussing two so-called identity technologies. And I intend to show how these two identity technologies threaten our identities. I will first show how the passport has changed from a relatively impersonal travel document to a highly personalized identity document. And in that change, it has, paradoxically almost, lost its relevance to our own sense of self. I will then talk about identity and identification on the internet, which shows a similar trajectory of being highly flexible to our sense of self, to a completely closed set of personalized definitions of who we are that do not accord with who we feel we are. And if you think that sounds vague at the moment, but I hope that in the end I will have made my point clearer and more convincing. But let's start with the passport. That's the sign for the internet, the mobile phone, of course. The passport. As you can read in most decent histories of the passport, there was already a first mention of a travel document in the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah. I think I pronounced that right, in the Old Testament. And there's a story about a Persian king who helps Nehemiah to travel safely and through other countries. And I have never quoted from the Bible, and I've never thought I would quote from the Bible, but I'm going to take the opportunity, and I'm going to quote from the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is traveling and says, quote, "Moreover, I said to the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come into Judah." That's the typical biblical language for saying that Nehemiah asked for letters for safe conduct from his king. And throughout history, we see kings issuing letters to their ambassadors, to their bankers, or to their spies, and these letters guarantee their safe passing through foreign lands. And there's another example on the screen from the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph issuing a Reisepass für das Ausland, a travel pass for foreign land. It's a pass for Herr Lunger traveling from Vienna to England, and Herr Lunger is, it says on the document, born in 1830, and he's described as being of medium height and with blonde hair. There's some discussion among historians where the word passport comes from. And some of them say it comes from passing the ports of the city, the gates of the city, passer la porte in French. And others say it comes from passing the harbors, passer le port in French. Doesn't really matter where it comes from, but the general etymology of the word signifies that notion of passing from one place to another, that notion of a travel document. On the recent travel document, we see there's identity information. We see who the carrier of the letter is supposed to be. It's, however, in no way yet an identification document. That additional meaning of the passport, combining a travel document with identity information, is actually fairly recent, and it dates from the early 20th century, and in particular from just after the First World War. And in fact, what I find funny is that just before the war, when the trains were becoming massively popular, there were states, France and England, and they did away with all travel documents altogether, because the trains had become so popular that it became impossible to control the travel documents. So imagine people were traveling without any kind of documents. and that was possible. I like that anecdote for obvious reasons. But with the First World War, and with the whole of Europe fighting, the fear of spies became so big that countries wanted to know which foreigners were in their countries, and specifically where they came from. And so there became a more urgent need from the perspective of the nation state to have national identification documents. Here we see some of the propaganda we know from the First World War, but also from the Second World War, signifying that fear of foreigners. And as an answer to that, the League of Nations said in 1920, we need a national passport, and that is what more or less became the standard. So what happened with the passport is that it slowly came to integrate all kinds of more precise information about who was carrying that passport. Those were written descriptions for the longest time, the kind of biographical information that we saw about Herr Lunger. But as soon as technology enabled that, the passport carried pictures as well, supposedly making it easier to identify that the person carrying it was really the person carrying it. And the next and most recent step in the history of the passport and further precision in terms of identification has, of course, come with biometrics. The current passport contains biometric information, at least my Dutch one does. It contains my fingerprints, and it contains a picture that makes it possible for all kinds of facial recognition systems to recognize me. And I guess all of us who have traveled to the US recently, or the last 5 years even, we know how incredibly intense these biometrics are being checked at the border, supposedly making it possible to identify who is not only a foreigner but also an enemy to the US nation state. And partly this helps. What we've seen with major passport fraud is that it no longer happens through faking the passport, as it used to happen before, but through faking the source documents, the documents that you need to apply for a passport, birth certificates, for instance. On the other hand, it doesn't work, and biometrics may not be as secure as we think they are. There's an infamous case from Scotland. A Scottish policewoman, I don't know whether anyone has ever heard the story. It was a policewoman called Shirley McKee, and her fingerprint was found on a murder scene before she arrived there as a policewoman. And she said, I had never been there before coming there as a police person. And, but the expert says it's your print. And she said, no, can't be, because I haven't been there. I had no reason to be there, don't know the victim. And the expert said, it's your print. And so she was convicted of this crime and spent years and years fighting the interpretation of that fingerprint by the experts. And in the end, she won the court case. And the judge who exonerated her, the judge said, the experts have made a wrong interpretation. These are not her prints. And in the newspapers writing about this court case, the headline was that biometrics, just another opinion. Which again is interesting because biometrics have this aura of being completely factual, fail-safe, and sort of the ideal identification measure. Now that safety and precision of the passport is not the main concern that I have. My point is that with respect to identity as a vulnerable value, there's a different problem. And to explain that, I need to show you my own passport picture from when I was 18 years old. And this is me at 18, or maybe at 20, probably 18. I don't remember exactly, but what I do remember is that I just swapped my heavy glasses for contact lenses. And I was planning for the trip to Israel, And this was in 1977, so you still could go to Israel without being politically completely incorrect. And I needed a passport. And when I went to the photographer to take the pictures for my passport, I was incredibly happy, because without the glasses, I finally felt somewhat confident that I might look good on the picture of my identity document. So, for the occasion, I also put a scarf on my head, suggesting an additional dimension to me, namely of sophistication and fashionability. And this is what came out of it. And it suited, at the time, the story I wanted to tell about myself. I took my passport to Israel, I took it to the United States, to Spain, to the Dominican Republic. I acquired visa and stamps. And it only became better and better as a part of me. And my passport told the story I wanted to tell at that moment in time. I am a good-looking young Dutch woman who has seen the world. Now, you probably guess where I'm going with this. Compare it to my current passport pictures. This one is for the biometric passport. And if you look up online what the rules are for the passport picture in the biometric passport, it says, in your photo you must, I quote, be facing forward and looking straight at the camera. Have a neutral expression and your mouth closed. Have your eyes open, visible and free from reflection or glare from glasses. Not have hair in front of your eyes. Not have a head covering, unless it's for religious or medical reasons. Not have anything covering your face. Not have any red eye. Not have any shadows on your face or behind you. In other words, one is not allowed to smile. Glasses, now I've become to like them now, but they should preferably not be in the picture. You cannot put stuff in your hair or on your head. You have to keep your head straight, not elegantly tilted. And all of this is so that the facial recognition software can recognize me. And it's needless to say that I don't like the picture and I don't feel it's me. I'm no longer particularly fond of my passport and it does not tell my story. It just says I have been subjected to the system. I'm a set of biometric features that can be measured by the systems of the nation state. So that is one dimension of identity and identification that has changed through the changes of the passport. And there is in fact only one dimension of your personal story that you are allowed to communicate through your passport nowadays, and that is religion. Said already on the rules. Headwear for religious reasons is allowed in the passport picture. And that has been, of course, the source of both political struggle and political controversy, but it has also led to a really funny experiment to undermine the system. So let's consider the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Members of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster call themselves Pastafarians. And their headgear of choice is the colander. The colander, I don't know how you pronounce that, colander, probably. And the purpose of the church is a serious one. It's to oppose, in the United States, the teaching of intelligent design and creationism in public schools. And every once in a while, you find a newspaper report, and the Daily Mail is specifically fond of these stories. You find a report of a nation or a state that is allowing the Pastafarians to wear their headgear on their identity documents. So this is the national identity document from the Czech Republic. And here are a couple of driver's licenses from Austria, from New Zealand, from California. There are more American states who have allowed this. And these stories are becoming so popular, and you can find them online. If you Google Pastafarians, you find a whole range of these pictures that I'm beginning to wonder whether this is a real story or a hoax. But in any case, it's a good story, and it also does what it needs to do. It questions how we represent ourselves on our passport. So, I have now shown how the passport has changed from being a travel document to being an identity document. But let's not forget that the passport is also a very, very symbolic document. It has become an incredibly strong and also controversial symbol for the nation state. And there are many, many issues in this respect. I thought this would come up later. But let's go there later. Yeah. So the first issue is, of course, that there are nations that don't have a state. We see here the passports of the Roma and the passport of a Native American tribe, the Iroquois. And they've had among themselves a massive discussion whether they wanted a passport. And in both groups and other groups as well, similar groups, one group says, yeah, we need a passport because our people then have a document saying they belong to our nation. And you can see how symbolic that is, because it won't give them any kind of identity or travel rights or administrative rights or whatever, because it's not a state document, but it's a document of belonging. And in these same people, among these same people, there are others who say, well, we don't need a passport. We are different kinds of nations than the nation states, and it is in our essence not to have documents. And of course, this is an unsolved issue, but it goes to show how symbolic that passport has become. And coming to the refugee crisis that Stephen already alluded to, already in the 1920s, when after the First World War there were as many people, as many refugees as there are now, and there was a similar refugee crisis and people on the run, people who had lost their homes and their countries. And already the League of Nations realized that those people needed travel documents and identity documents as well. So with the official passport, the League of Nations also introduced a refugee passport called the Nansen passport, after Fridtjof Nansen, the Scandinavian who thought of this. Current refugees, when they have a status that they can stay, at least so, that's what we call it in the Netherlands, they have a status. And if they don't have a status, they're illegal. They have identity documents as well. Of course, we see here attention arising around refugees and migrants who have different passports than the passports of their receiving countries. And that is what the quote of Ahmed Abu Talib, the mayor of Rotterdam, refers to. He says, a passport is not just a travel document, it is a responsibility. And that sounds really nice, but you have to know when he said that after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo last year in Paris. And he also said to his young Muslims in Rotterdam, he said, I don't like that you criticize Charlie Hebdo. If you can't stand a joke from a silly magazine, then you'd better, and I have to translate it like this, I'm sorry, then you'd better fuck off. It was as rude in Dutch. Yeah. And so here, Ahmed Abu Talib, who himself is at the center of passport discussions because he is a Moroccan and Dutch, so he has a Moroccan passport and a Dutch passport, and the extreme right in the Netherlands says, you have to hand in your Moroccan passport, you cannot be both. So he is at the receiving end of criticism about the passport, but he's also handing out criticism around the passport. And he in fact says, if you don't like it here, you better hand in your passport. And this is of course exactly what some of radical Muslim IS fighters do. There's videos online of French IS fighters symbolically burning their French passport before they go to Syria. So that is all around the passport as a symbolic document. So it's a travel document, it's an identity document, it's a symbolic document. But it's certainly not an innocent document. It represents our identities, but in a highly problematic way. It does not tell our personal story anymore, and it has become a symbol of inclusion, but also of exclusion. And I will come back to these issues in more detail later. Let's first move to another domain. Let's first move to digital identity. There's a clear cut here between the passport and digital identity. 5 years ago, if you would ask, in this country, who has a smartphone, about 1/3 of the people would raise their hands. And obviously I'm going to ask you now whether you have a smartphone or not. Could you raise your hands? Who has a smartphone? I'm identifying the people who don't. All right, thank you. That's almost 90%. The national average here in the UK is 66%, and in the Netherlands, the national average is 81%. Any kind of age difference there has been is rapidly disappearing. For most of us, the phone has become our main access point to the internet, especially in areas everywhere here in the UK where you have 4G, fourth generation internet coverage. So everybody is online, every time, everywhere. We all know that, right? We are no longer the only ones on the internet. There's this buzzword called the Internet of Things. And in fact, it has become the Internet of Everything, meaning that all kinds of people, all kinds of things, everything is becoming connected to each other. And maybe you remember Nicholas Negroponte saying in 1995 that at some point we will have our refrigerators on the internet. You remember that, Stephen, that he said that? And we all thought that's ridiculous. Why would you want your internet or your refrigerator to be on the internet? And that is now has become more or less common. Everything is becoming connected. And just like we're not saying no longer there's electrical lamps here, we won't say in the near future that things are connected, because it will become the standard. Buildings, roads, water, other parts of our city infrastructure, it will all become connected. And just let me give you one example of how that works. If you come to my work city, Rotterdam, with your car and you enter the green zone, then there's a huge traffic sign that first monitors your car number, your license plate, and then it immediately connects your license plate to the national license registrations, and it tells the system how old your car is and whether it is polluting. So within a second you get a message back saying license plate XYZ is allowed into the green zone. License plate ABC cannot go into the green zone and will get fined with 90 euros. This is live in Rotterdam at the moment. That is to show that everything is becoming connected. And the way for us to get access to that connected world is through our smartphones, of course. Our smartphone has become the passport of the modern time. It gives us access to the virtual world, like the passport gives us access to other countries. Like the passport, it's also a highly symbolic device. It's not only in the choice of smartphones. You're an iPhone person or a Samsung person, and my youngest son is a Fairphone person. But it's also a log almost of everything you do, the smartphone. A life log, your chat files, your photographs. And in that sense, the smartphone is a more personal identity device than the passport is. So let's look a bit more at that online identity. You may remember this, specifically my generation might remember this. It's a cartoon by Peter Stein. It was published in the New Yorker, and it's probably one of the most repeated images about the internet. It's from 1993, and this was before we had web browsers. This was in the time of Usenet, of bulletin boards, of MMOPRGs, massive, God, what was it? Massive, and at least multiplayer online role-playing games, something like that. Mods, all text-based applications, right? Now, texts give you anonymity, as we can understand that. You can type in any name or identity, everything you want, and nobody can see you, so you can pretend to be anyone you liked. And that was part of the excitement of the internet at the time. Men could pretend to be women, shy people could pretend to be sociable, heteros could pretend to be gay, and the other way around. Gays could come out without any kind of problems. And I remember an article from that time that said, well, you could also, you don't have to be a human being, you could be an animal, you don't have to be single, you could be multiple, you could be a swarm of bees, for instance. That is all captured in that cartoon. You could be anything you want. And of course, in 1993, that cartoon and that idea about the internet suited the times very well, because we were in the middle of multiculturalism. We were in the middle of postmodernism. We thought about identities as being fluid, as being multiple, as being contradictory, as being never fixed. And Judith Butler's book about gender trouble is from 1990, so was in the middle of that whole movement. The book that captured that really well at the time was Sherry Turkle's Life on the Screen. We know Sherry Turkle now from a rather somber, bleak book that is called Connected But Alone, which is telling, right? So we are all looking at our smartphones. We have 45 minutes without smartphones now, but I know you're dying to get to your smartphone, especially when I'm talking about smartphone. I know you want to take it out. Just wait a little bit longer. But she's written a really sort of pessimistic book about our connected lives now, but at the time she was really at the vanguard and talking about the possibilities of the internet to experiment with your identity is something really good. It would help us. It would provide a postmodern laboratory for identity experiments, as she said. The internet gave us an escape from the confines of our physical identities. It freed us from stereotypes, and it was thought that dichotomous gender binaries would disappear because we could be everything we wanted. At the time, some people did research about how often people on the internet really swapped genders. And it appeared, of course, that it was only a very small percentage. So the ideal, the discourse, the utopia was much bigger than the reality. And we find that notion that people reproduce their stereotypes rather than undermine them in later research as well. Nevertheless, the then technical affordances of the internet and the discourse around it offered us almost complete freedom around our identities. Use different ones, develop different personae, and keep them or change them at will. That was the idea. If you didn't live that period, it's hard to understand the excitement that we had at the time, specifically in a conservative time that we are in the middle of now. It was a rather short period. And in fact, what has happened is that whole notion of gender bending and other forms of identity experiments, that it hasn't only disappeared, it has become suspect and increasingly impossible as well. It has become suspect, for instance, because, of course, people have abused that freedom, pretending to be somebody with false pretense. And, of course, there's quite a lot of discussion about stranger danger, about abductions. There's a huge moral panic around this issue, specifically in the UK papers, of course, much, much more than in the Netherlands. I can see that traveling from here to there. That is a different issue. There was a television program called How to Catch a Predator. Has anyone ever seen that? Yeah? That sort of is part of that moral panic as well. But that's one of the reasons. There's real cases of abuse and the moral panics around it that identity experiments have become suspicious. There is a second reason as well, maybe a bit of an unexpected one, but that has to do with reality television. Big Brother, the beginning of reality television, of course, which is a Dutch format but was incredibly popular here, was quite a lot of audience research around that, asking what is it that people like about Big Brother. And invariably, the answer there is that there's some kind of soap opera appeal. What would I do in that situation? That's what audiences wonder about. Is it a morally acceptable choice? So it's a moral barometer in a way. And very importantly in this discussion about identity, are these people themselves in the house? Are they authentic? Or do they pretend? Are they fake? And that question, can I be myself, that's the key question in other reality programs as well. Even in makeover programs, even in cosmetic surgery programs. Because invariably what you will hear from candidates in these programs after their operation is that they say, I feel much more like myself now than before. So in reality television, it's an expression of that cultural moment, that cultural force to be yourself, to be oneself. To be not many selves, not multiple selves, but to be oneself and to be oneself. So that's a cultural pressure. Final reason why that whole identity experiment notion of digital identity has disappeared is because technology itself makes it more difficult nowadays. Hardly anyone, well, we app through chats, right? But most applications nowadays are visual ones. So we see who we are talking to. We see who we are connected to. And that makes it much, much harder to experiment with identities. And in fact, again, if people do that by, for instance, embellishing their Tinder profiles and making themselves look better than they are in real life, then again they'll get a television program running after them and revealing that they are not who they say they are. So, abuse, cultural and technical forces all have worked against the early freedom and flexibility of our identities. There's institutional forces of commerce and the state as well. Since the Snowden revelations, we know how deeply we are being monitored, right, by institutions like agencies like GCHQ, National Security, NSA, Homeland Security, etc., etc. We've also heard that they collaborate with all kinds of big internet companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, there's a whole list of them, right? And we know that all of us are at least in 200 or 300 databases across the world. All of our data are. Axiom is one of these data brokers, it was big international data brokers. And there's huge privacy issues here, of course, but what happens through these technologies is that, again, they tend to make us one instead of many. Facebook, for instance, for the longest time did not allow you to be on there, to have a profile with another name than your own. And there was a huge discussion about transvestites who wanted to be on Facebook with their transvestite persona. And Facebook didn't allow that. And after a lot of public uproar, of course, they had to pull that decision back. But it sort of testifies of that force to be one online. Google, similarly, this whole range of Google services, and what Google says in their privacy policies is, we will help you streamline your identity. If we find that you're working with a Google application with a different identity, we will help you to make that one as a service to you, but also, of course, as a service to themselves, because they can track you much, much easier then. So all these forces make us one. And I want to show you How much time do I have left, Stephen? 10 minutes? Okay. Can we skip the film and see if we can, or is it just going to... Twice. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to sum up more or less, and then we can see whether we want to see the film or not, because I think that's more important. Thinking about identity as a vulnerable value, we have all been taught and we have experienced in many different ways that our identities are multiple and contradictory. So this is a picture I took from the internet that nicely represents that. So it could be Muslim, Latina, woman, baby boomer, and mother at the same time. And we could fill in all kinds of different categories here. I could be a professional, a father, a gay man, and a sports person at the same time. So these intersecting identities is something that we sort of automatically assume as persons and as academics as well. And I'm not going to explain that in detail because we know that kind of theoretical work. What I've tried to show through the example of the passport and the online identity, that there are many forces working against that multiplicity. And so one of them are the forces of the nation state. Right? Nations want us to be citizens of that nation and not of many, many different nations. That is a force in the passport as well. Biometric technologies want clear features for ourselves and want our biometrics to be stable and not contradictory. It's another, a technical force. The forces of online commerce, the Google example that I just gave you, also work against that kind of diverse identity, against the notion of a multiple identity, because if you have many different persona online, commercial forces can't follow you. Then there's, of course, the extreme right in Europe in particular. You see a cartoon here of our Dutch extreme right politician Geert Wilders, but Marine Le Pen is exactly the same, and there's other political parties that also are exactly the same, and that don't want us to have multiple identities, but they just want us to relate to our new nation states. Then I try to convince you that reality TV is another force that sort of brings us into one clear category. And of course, the forces of the intelligence agencies. What happens with these forces? What happens with these forces is that they show us how our identity, and we experience our identity as a story about ourselves, how our identity is threatened by all these forces. How the multiple identities that we want to live, that we have, that we express, that we perform, that we feel, that we tell, how they're all being punched on, in a way, by these external forces. And that's the tension between identity and identification, and I can sum that up in a different way again. The way we experience identity is as a story about ourselves. Identity is narrative. It's also social, because the story doesn't make sense if we don't tell it to somebody. The story doesn't make sense if it's just our own story and not related to others, to other communities, other people. It is therewith also interactive, our identity. And it is multiple. We're never one person. For instance, during this talk, I'm so aware that we are being live streamed and that my family can see what I'm doing. So I have this combined identity here of being a professor and a mother. And boys, I hope you're not watching, actually. I mean, it would be really embarrassing. But that multiple sense of who you are is also key to our identity. So identity is part of our life worlds, part of our everyday experience. Identity is our sense of self in that way. Now, if we look again, but in another way, to the forces of identification, we see that the forces of identification don't accept a narrative, they want facts. we all know that when we call a call service about the taxes, for instance, and say, but listen, I am an academic working in the Netherlands, living in the Netherlands, working here in England, I shouldn't pay my taxes here, which is my story. And then they just come with a number of facts and say, I have to pay taxes. And we all have this experience, right? That the people there don't want to hear your story, they just want to fill in their forms. Identification also requires us to be individuals. There's no identification system that asks how you stand in the world. There's only one that I can think of, and that is Facebook, that when your Facebook identity has been hacked, then they ask you to come up with 3 people in your surroundings that can say that you are who you are, which is a social way of identifying, but all other ones are individual. Nothing interactive about it. It's very static. This is who you are. On my passport picture, my passport, I have been, I want to say 5'6", 1 meter and 74 centimeters since I was 18. There's no change in that, so it's very static. Your biometric is static. And again, that's a force of identification that threatens that vulnerable value of interactive identity. Single identities, I think I've made that very clear. In terms of Habermas, if you want to take him out to understand all of this or to look at all of this, it's a force of the system, a world against the live world. And finally, what identification does is it removes our sense of self and it makes us a subject to systems of identification. And it gives us, in many cases, a sense of being subjected, of being a subject. And those are the things that I wanted to sort of throw up for discussion. If we have time, we could watch a video, but that's much more about privacy things. I think there are possibly questions. And if you would like to read more about it, I have written here and there elements of this story. This is combined, single stories combined into a multiple presentation. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Well, I forgot to say that we are being live streamed, so those of you who are wanted by any international police forces, it's probably too late to duck your head now. Everyone's seen you, including Lisbeth's children. So it's time, I think, for questions and discussion. I know that Jay Blumler, who is here, is going to want to deliver some thanks to Lisbeth, but I think I want to carry on with the questions and discussion first, because this was such an interesting and for me at least, compelling presentation that there's lots here to get our teeth into and ask questions about, but be critical as well. And Lisbeth won't mind that. And even if she does mind that, she deserves it because she's an academic, so we be critical as well. So, who has the first question or comment? Don't be shy, don't be shy. Right, over there. A microphone will come to you. Say who you are.
People here would know me by the name Noon. I've just recently finished my PhD. Just out of interest, what do you think would be the worst or the biggest problem if the process of identifying someone, so the concept of identification, gathers the data from the process of, the other one, the identity, but then collects that data in terms of, if you think in terms of big data, and then try to spit that identity or identification back to the person, what do you think would be the worst problem that can come out of that scenario?
That's actually what the film was about, but we're not going to show the whole film, but I can tell you what's going on there. It shows an Italian guy watching football. He goes to his fridge and wants to have a pizza while watching the football. But his fridge is empty, so we see him looking in the fridge, empty. He calls the pizzeria and says, hi, I want to order a pizza so-and-so, etc. And then the woman says, oh, hi, James. Hi, James. Shall we deliver that at your work or at your home? And your work is this address and your home is that address. And so yeah, I'm at home, so deliver it at home. All right. And how are you going to pay for that, James? By credit card. Oh, that won't be possible because I see you don't have a credit here. All right. Okay, I'll pay cash then. Okay, and what kind of pizza do you want? I want a pizza salami. Your doctor says that's not a good idea because... All right, okay, I'll take a pizza with something. And then he says, can I have a Coke with that? No, well, you're at risk of diabetes. And so he gets upsetter and more and more upset and asks at some point, how do you know all this? But of course, that is exactly the scenario that you're describing, that all these data, which is happening at the moment, are being combined and you're being profiled. And that actually, what the scenario that you see there, it's called How to Order a Pizza in 2015. If you Google it, you can watch it at home. It's really funny. But that's actually under current European privacy law, which changed just in January. That is forbidden. That's not allowed to do that. Of course, it happens all the time. And with big data, you can, and geographic information systems, you can profile people without having personal data of them. And that is and legislation is not up to that yet, but we're becoming more and more aware of it. That it's a slightly different kind of discussion than the one I engaged in today, because we talk about these privacy matters so often already, and I wanted to have that particular look at the other side, how all these technologies and all these cultural forces as well take away our possibility to experiment with identity, to try out different kind of identity, do something else than you normally do, and things like that. But that doesn't mean that privacy is just as important. It's a different dimension of the same discussion. Yeah, and congratulations with your PhD.
Hi, Elizabeth. I'm Jairo Lugo Cando. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Media and Communication. I remember the first time we met many years ago, there was really interesting paper about how in the football stadium in Birmingham, they were starting to sell Indian food and Asian food to try to attract Asian public to go and see football. Mm. And this relates to the question, because I want to hear what you think about what I feel is imposed identity. I'm one of the many unlucky persons who had to apply for a British passport. And the whole process was an imposition, to the point that even today, when I speak in Facebook to my Venezuelan identity, I'm ashamed to say that I have applied for passport, because the first thing is, did you swear for the Queen?
Yeah.
And none of my friends can believe that I actually had to do it. So this imposition of identity goes in several realms. And you were saying how Facebook makes you tell who you are, and perhaps that's not really who you are. And all this imposition, and what I believe is happening is that increasingly more this convergence between the passport and the new technologies is creating this very aggressive impositions of identity. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that, because that is, in a different way, is exactly the point I wanted to make. And I'm glad that you add to that those are really aggressive forces, because sometimes when you give the examples, for instance, that Facebook doesn't allow transvestites to have their own identity on their site, people say, yeah, but that's not that important, is it? There's more important issues than that element. Another example that I often use is a video artist in London goes through the London Tube as a magician, and he has melted the chip from his Oyster card on his magic wand. And so when he goes through the tube, he sort of waves his wand to the gates, and then the gates open, and he goes through. And I think that's just totally fantastic. And it shows how he adjusts the technology to his identity performance at that time. Of course, the authorities don't like it because you're not allowed to meddle with your chip. I think it's ridiculous that they don't allow it because he does pay, right? He does everything right, but he's not allowed to turn that identity instrument into that identification instrument into something that suits his identity. Again, people then say, well, that's a silly example, but it is silly in a way. It's funny, but it also tells the story in a very quintessential, in a very, very condensed way. And so, but the forces, of course, behind it are much more aggressive and, dangerous, I would say. Yeah. I hate, for instance, I'm off Facebook now for a while, but I hated always that I couldn't change my identity there. And so I've decided to be a 15-year-old boy a long time ago, but I'm not allowed to change that back anymore, otherwise they throw me off, right? So I find that strange. Why can't I be many people at the same time? Not to talk about the passport, of course. Yeah.
Hi, Lee Edwards from the School of Media. I started thinking at the end about the fluidity of the online space, the fact that it's also constantly changing, and so the notion of controlling identity is something that in itself, so the identification is always fluctuating and has to find new ways of imposing itself really on you. And so I wondered whether you had any thoughts about when these moments of vulnerability emerge. I also was going back to this idea of the migration crisis and the fact that migrants use social media and mobile technologies incredibly powerfully to keep in touch with the place where their identity is valid when they are in a place where their identity has been taken away. So it has that side to it as well. I just wondered whether you had thoughts about when those possibilities become sidelined by moments of over-visibility, so you have to be controlled again. I don't know whether you had any thoughts on that.
Your question makes me realize that I've been talking about identity as a vulnerable value, in fact, at two levels. One at the level of a more or less abstract concept, and that is vulnerable towards these forces, against these forces. I don't know what's vulnerable against. The other one is at the level of personal vulnerability. And what you can see, interestingly, is that people use indeed the same technologies that impose these identities to work around it. And you gave the example of the refugees. There's another, what I find a fantastic example about an American professor with a Muslim background and a Muslim name. And he was arrested on suspicion of terrorism because of his name and where he was at a certain point in time. He was released, but he thought this is going to happen more often. So what he does now with his telephone, with his smartphone, is he logs systematically where he is, what he does, so that he has a preemptive alibi in a way, right? And so he uses live logging just sort of to get around that vulnerability of his identity in a way. So I'm not sure whether that's an answer, but sort of something that came up in my mind because of your question. Usually that's an answer, but...
Thank you. I'm Simon Popple from the School of Media as well. There's a very famous 1930s novel called The Death Ship, which I don't know if you're aware of it. It's called The Death Ship, and it's about stateless people. It's about people who are refugees from Nazi Germany and fascist Spain, and their only existence is travelling the world as merchant seamen because they can't do anything else because they don't have passports. And that's a very negative, a very unpleasant sort of vision of statelessness. And I wonder if you've got a sense of what a less inscriptive notion of nationhood might be like.
I think what the current discussion is, among all kinds of discussions about the relevance of the nation state, the disappearing relevance of the nation state, the crisis of the nation state, is that cities are becoming more and more important. And I've been talking about smart cities, but they're becoming important in a different way. And it seems that from quite a lot of research among migrants and refugees living in cities is that they find it easier to combine their initial national identity with their new urban identity. So in both my cities, Amsterdam where I live and Rotterdam where I work, there's about 170 nationalities living there, like probably the same as here in Leeds or any other big English city. And what you see, at least in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, is that that combination of a national identity with an urban identity is much, much easier than that combination of two national identities. So Moroccan boys will also feel Amsterdammer or Rotterdammer. And then at some points when the two teams are playing against each other, Ajax and Feyenoord, then that urban identity will take over. And so they won't connect with the Moroccan boys in Amsterdam or in Rotterdam or vice versa, but they will connect on the urban identity. And so I think in that sense, again, it's possibly not an answer, but something that comes up while thinking about your question. I think cities are becoming much and much more important and possibly key drivers in that integration and tolerance, or whatever old-fashioned word you want to use for that. Yeah. Thanks. Good questions.
Ray Brown. Do you feel that the degree to which we can be classified and digitized is sinister? And would you like to speculate about where it can go? Because things have developed, as you have indicated, so rapidly. Mm-hmm. Where will we be in 10 years' time and 20 years' time?
I always strongly believe that each time has its own sinister forces. So before digitization and categorization, we had small communities that were as restrictive as the bigger system is now. So that's one thing I would say. I also am a strong believer in forces and counter forces. So I'm a Hegelian, you could say. What you see happening already is that people are sort of trying to find ways to get off the grid. And there's a whole movement called the off the grid movement. Those are people that sort of make their own sustainable units and are not connected to anything. And you can do that in the extreme way, which is very unpractical, but you can also do it in bits and pieces. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think it also depends very much on where you live on this globe. And European legislation, the newest directive, no, it's not a directive, it's actually real law, forbids quite a lot of things. And of course, there's always companies and states that sort of try to circumvent that, but we shouldn't deny the relevance of that legislation, specifically in Europe. I'm not saying that for a reason. I could, but I'm with President Obama on this.
Okay. This has been fascinating and I think that we are going to be going away and wanting to think about many of these points for a long time afterwards. And incidentally thinking also about the very immediate implications around, for example, the difference between European and US regulation around data, which is huge and interesting. Well, this is a Jay Blumler Lecture. Lisbeth has said how delighted she is to be able to give it, and one of the delights of it is that Jay is here and is always there, not only at the Jay Blumler Lecture, but around the university, and a great colleague and friend to many of us here. And he would like to thank Elizabeth for coming, and I think thank all of you for coming as well. So over to you, Jay.
Well, Lisbeth, in opening up this cornucopia, this treasure chest of intellectual and normative gems of all sorts of kinds, I've been really moved that you linked it to the notion of vulnerable values. Other lecturers in the series have sometimes connected what they wanted to say with something I might have written or said in the past. But you went right to the heart in that, with what I would like to be considered to stand for, and I thank you from the heart for that. It made me also think that since 1992, when I used that phrase as a subtitle in an edited book, I think you've demonstrated that more values have become vulnerable, and some of them have been becoming more vulnerable, unfortunately. Before I come back to thanks to you, I'd like to say some thanks to others, if I may. And first of all, to all the members of the School of Media and Communication here who have enabled me to be part of their community, become friends and colleagues. I believe there's research which demonstrably proves that the more social contacts one has in older years, the longer one lives. So I thank you for my longevity, but I'm not sure Bethany Klein, the head of the school, would. Because, you know, I think the budgets for these occasions are becoming tight. I don't think they bargain for having to fund, I think it's now 10 of them. And Bethany, are you here? Did anyone sing happy birthday to you last week? Well, my thought was that if they didn't, we all should. But if they have, it's worth doing again. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bethany. Happy birthday to you. And I'd also like to thank some friends who aren't from academic circles who've come to share this experience with me. Jean Robinson was a pretty good student of political theory when I taught her at Ruskin College in 1953. But she moved on from there, and she became, I believe, one of the best informed health policy activists in the country. I'd like to thank Katie Jakes. She sings with me in a local choir. She ferries me back and forth from the choir to my home, and she produces wonderfully crafted greetings cards, sometimes at my commission. And Bethany, we've got one for you here that you can pick up afterwards. I'd like to thank Ray Brown and Roz for coming tonight. Ray started out as a member of what was then the Television Research Unit here, and I'm indulging accurately in superlatives. He was probably the best moderator of focus groups I've ever encountered. Since then, he has moved on, and he's become an outstanding and well-regarded radio dramatist. Is Mark Beeson here? Oh, yes, well, I certainly want to thank Mark and Caroline, his daughter, for being with me as well. Good family friends, probably longer contact with me than in a direct way than anyone else. And from my point of view, the best informed expert on classical music that I know. Well, back to Lisbeth. Stephen referred to her innovative quality in his introduction. In advance of this lecture, I said to myself, I think of her as an explorer. That's not only because she's had visiting appointments ranging from Norway to Jamaica, nor because she has cast her academic net across such a wide range of communication channels and so on, but also because she has this unique capability of taking us into places and trails that others have not opened up, and then opening them up for others to follow productively. Now, I may, this will be unexpected, I may get a little bit frivolous, but you'll not mind that, because one of your core themes is one should not compartmentalize politics, citizenship, entertainment, fun, music, all that. They should converge together. I don't know if you noticed that I was taking some notes while you were speaking. It so happened that I, just by coincidence, brought along a libretto of Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. And those of you who are familiar with the Pirates of Penzance may remember the autobiographical song of Major Stanley, which starts, I am the very model of a modern Major General of information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. Well, the verses go on like that. He's continually trying to find some way of rhyming, making a difficult rhyme from one line to the next. So he's, for example, at the end of the first verse, about binomial theorems, I'm teeming with a lot of news. With many facts about the square of the hypotenuse, and so on. Well, I somehow thought, just while you were speaking, of course, that it wasn't prematurely composed. According to Van Zonen, there are absolutely plenty of ways of managing your and our identity. Party leaders always try to get the words in media. Crying journalists, hear us, we all need ya. And although you'll not find much you'd call original around the precincts of Westminster Bridge and all. As for Jay's works, sadly most are crass short. He's proud, however, that he's got a U.S. passport. And that's reminded me of an anecdote. Not many of you have experienced my habit of being reminded of a funny story of my life, but it's very relevant to your talk. In 1980, I had a visiting position at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is surrounded by lakes. And I was invited to go out on somebody's boat, and my passport dropped into the drink. My God, in a week's time, I was supposed to go to Acapulco in Mexico to make a presentation at an ICA conference. What was I to do? Well, I learned that you could get into Mexico at that time without a passport. But I was going to go back to Los Angeles to see my mother, who lived in Southern California, and would I be let back in without a passport? My mother was very worried. She kept on ringing me up with advice. And here's the point. The last piece of advice she gave me was, Jay, when you get back to Los Angeles Immigration and Customs, chew gum. Now, I'm sure that you'll want to include that as a reference. You're allowed to in your next writing on this subject. It's so apposite. Well, in addition to being an explorer, your thought, okay, well, explorer, that's range, that's breadth. But your thought also has such depth and reaches such heights. And I'm afraid there's another song that reminds me. As you know, I have got a store of spirituals I can draw on for occasions like this. You may not know, but this is a great one. Ezekiel saw the wheel. Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of the air. Oh, the big will run by faith, and the little will run by the grace of God. Wheel in a wheel, way in the middle of the air. Now, Lisbeth saw the wheel, way up in the middle of the air. Lisbeth saw the wheel, way in the middle of the air. Oh, the big wheel run by Jay, and the little wheel run by Habermas. Wheel in a wheel, way in the middle of the air. Thank you so much, Lisbeth.
Jay. Thank you, Jay. Jay's junior, the head of state of this country, was 90 yesterday. Several years younger than him, and she doesn't sing. So there you are. Take your choice. I prefer Jay. So now it's time to have a drink. Some of you might have thought Jay had a drink, but believe me, he hasn't. But I've seen men walking out of the pubs in Leeds with ditties equally composed, and it is now time for us to go out, have some food, have some drink, mingle, talk, and be joyful. But do think about all of the things that we've heard this evening. Think about the significance of the opportunities and the frustrations that exist in terms of being able to move around the world and being able to have a passport. And I think one of the things that I will want to take away from today's lecture is the significance of a growing divide in the world between those who can move around and those who are stuck. And that's something that a school like ours ought to be spending a lot of time thinking about. Thank you all for coming. Do enjoy yourself.